Now we're going to move into our long-term memory, which we've kind of referred to because they all kind of work together. So we're going to give it its own section and talk about working or long-term memory all by itself. And so our long-term memory can be thought of as a library of memory. It's a durable, because it's going to last for quite some time, it's a durable type of storage with our past events and learned knowledge all kept within. It has a large storage capacity, and there's some talk that maybe it's an unlimited storage capacity. There's some really cool case studies that we don't have time to go into, but there are people who have strong memories, vivid memories of basically every moment of their life. And they seem to remember and store so much more than everyday people. So their existence has this maybe it's unlimited storage idea. So we're not quite sure. And if nothing goes wrong, our long-term memory can endure for a lifetime. You can remember things for your entire life because of this durable storage system. And so we're going to break our long-term memory into two broad categories. The first is our declarative memory. You'll also sometimes see it called explicit memory. And we're going to use the two terms interchangeably. So declarative memory is something that can be verbalized. You can explicitly state or talk about the thing that you remember. And this declarative memory consists of two different parts. The first is episodic. We've also already seen episodic mentioned for our working memory. And this is going to be the same idea, where it is an episode. There's a timeliness, a story to it. But in this case, for our declarative memory, the episodic part is talking about personal experiences, things that you have lived through yourself. So your episodic memory would be you recalling episodes or stories from your own life. The second part of our declarative memory, another part that you can explicitly talk about, is the semantic memory. And semantic memories are your general factual knowledge. So it's, if I asked you, how long do great white sharks live? Maybe that could be something that you remember. Or I ask you, which sports team won the Stanley Cup in whatever year? That's semantic knowledge. And the difference between semantic and episodic is semantic, it would be that sports team. So those people won that event, so you can remember that fact. But if we were looking at the episodic part of it, you would say maybe I remember who won because I was at my parents' house and we were all gathered around watching the Stanley Cup playoffs. So the episodic part is your individual memory of an experience, but the semantic knowledge is going to be that specific fact. And both of those are declarative memory or explicit memory because you can explicitly talk about it. You can tell someone about something you personally experienced, or you can tell someone a fact. And this is going to make a little bit more sense when we start talking about procedural memory. And procedural memory is going to be implicit. And for both of those, it means that you cannot verbalize this kind of memory. So procedural means it's going to be a skill or an action. It's a procedure that you can do. And it's implicit because you can't explicitly state it. You can't talk about doing this. It's something implicit. It's something that you just do, but you can't describe. So you can't verbalize it, and it's going to be your skills and actions. And some of our conditioned responses, if we think back to our chapter on learning, some of our operant conditioning stuff seems to fall under procedural memory because it's not something you are declaring. But a procedural memory would be, I haven't ridden a bike in years, but if I had a bike here right now, I could figure out how to ride it again really quickly because I have the procedural memory for that skill. It's the same way that you can write on a piece of paper. You have the procedural memory of the skill of writing. So things that you aren't capable of talking about, you can't really describe how you can write or how you can ride a bike, but you can do it. So that's why it's procedural rather than something declarative. And it would be a very good idea to remember the difference between procedural versus declarative memory, and even within declarative, the difference between episodic versus semantic. Okay, so that's long-term memory. And now we can start talking about, well, what happens when it goes wrong? And these terms are going to come back again in just a little bit once we start talking about some really cool case studies. But first we have to understand these terms. So when our long-term memory is damaged, when we have problems with storing these memories for long-term, it can come in two different flavors. You can have anterograde amnesia, which is the loss of ability to assimilate and retain new knowledge. So maybe you can remember all of the things that have happened to you in the past, but as soon as you suffer an injury, usually some pretty bad brain damage, you can't then form new memories. You can't put anything new into that long-term storage. It can't get stored away, and you can't remember anything new. But your old information is still there, so everything before the accident is fine, but anything new just doesn't exist. It's a blank slate after that point. And if you have seen the movie Memento, or Ghajini, clearly I haven't seen this one. I did watch Memento actually as one of my undergraduate classes, but unfortunately we don't have time for that. But if you're looking for a very cool movie, Memento is about someone with anterograde amnesia who has no ability to store new memories. And so it's him constantly having his memory reset, usually about every 20 seconds, because that's how long his short-term or working memory can hold information if he's not maintaining it. So you hit that reset button every couple of seconds, which is interesting to watch. Or other than anterograde amnesia, we can have the other form, and that's retrograde amnesia. And retrograde is loss of memory for events that have happened in the past. And so the way I always remember it is that retro is old, so you're forgetting old things. And this would be an example of, say, the Bourne Identity or RoboCop, where after the traumatic incident, they can't remember their past. But everything that they've experienced since the accident, they're able to form new memories, with the incident that caused the brain damage being sort of the first thing that they can remember afterwards. And so we have these two options, anterograde and retrograde amnesia, and maybe we can start looking at sort of what differences are between people that have the two of them, which will lead us into some case studies in just a moment. And so, as I've already jumped the gun on, we can start looking at this dissociation, this pulling apart of the different parts of memory. And if we have our short-term and long-term memory as our major types of memory, mostly our sensory memory is just, it is what it is, and it doesn't get a whole lot of attention, which is almost too bad. But we care mostly about our short and long-term memory because they seem to be involved in the longer retention of information. And so people have always wondered, are they two separate systems? Are they immediately related? Are they something we can pull apart? Could we have one of those impaired while the other still functions. And I already blew the surprise of a whole bunch of case studies that we can use to see if we could find someone who has an impairment in either short or long-term memory with the other type of memory still functional. And so that's what we're going to spend the next couple of slides on. All right, so the first of our case studies is going to be one Clive Wearing. And Clive was a British musician and composer. And when he was younger, he got a virus that attacked his central nervous system. And specifically, the part that we care about is that he had pretty severe damage to his hippocampus. And this damage led him to develop both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So quite the extreme case. So he can't form new memories and he can't recall past memories. So he's stuck in this state where he can't pull anything out of his long-term storage, he can't remember previous things, and he can't store anything in long-term memory to remember later. So he's stuck at this point where he basically just has his working or short-term memory. So he can exist in a single moment. He has about 20 seconds and then his memory resets. And I actually have a video in just a couple of slides where we can see that in action. And it's really interesting and almost difficult to watch because he's someone who doesn't have any memory of the past, no thought of the future. He just sort of lives in the moment. And it's really neat, which is, again, why we kind of like all of these case studies and special situations. Now, one of the cool parts about Clive Wearing and why we're going to bring him up, in addition to, both anterograde and retrograde amnesia, Clive isn't entirely incapable of learning. He's actually able to learn new tasks. But if we scoot back, I went too far. If we scoot back, so his episodic and semantic memory are damaged. He can't remember things that happened to him in the past. And even a lot of his semantic memory is damaged. So episodic's not really working so well, but he can use his procedural memories. So it's something implicit or unconscious. Those are those actions and skills. So he still has long-term memory of things that he can do. So we had mentioned that he was a musician, a composer, and he can still play piano beautifully, despite the fact that he can't remember anything and he can't form new memories. So he doesn't necessarily know that he can play piano until he sits down and plays, which is, again, really freaking cool. And it's not just being able to remember things that he had learned in the past. Repeated exposure to new things, developing new procedural skills, things like maybe learning to write with his left hand or learning to do some task that involves motions. As he's repeatedly exposed to it, he may not remember that he's ever done this task before, but he will get gradually better because he's building on that procedural memory. And so he doesn't really need that conscious control or attention. He just sort of does it implicitly. And again, very cool. And so our take-homes from Clive Wearing is that procedural memory and declarative memory are going to be different systems. Because for him, he had damaged his declarative memory, but his procedural memory is still intact. So he has lost his explicit memory, but has retained the implicit memory. And because he had severe damage to his hippocampus, but still had functioning procedural memory, we now know that procedural memory doesn't really require the hippocampus to happen. But it also then on the converse tells us that the hippocampus is important for forming and retrieving semantic and episodic long-term memory, our declarative memory. So we've figured out through this one case study where severe damage to the hippocampus caused problems for one type of memory and didn't cause problems for another, we now know what role the hippocampus has. But we're going to talk about next one of the most famous case studies in psychology, and this is HM. And HM, we now know, was Henry Molaison. And Henry suffered from really severe epilepsy. He would have seizures so bad that it was starting to affect his health. They were happening constantly. They were having tons of problems. And to try and deal with the severity of his epilepsy, he had what was called a bilateral temporal lobectomy. So bilateral meaning on both sides or in both lobes. Temporal meaning it's in the temporal lobe. And lobectomy meaning that they pulled out those parts of his brain. And so during this procedure, they resected part of the hippocampus, most of his amygdala, and a whole bunch of other cortices in the area. I'm actually going to scoot ahead. So this is our normal view of the brain that we've seen before. And in this case, they scooped out this whole section in the middle, in completely removing the hippocampus plus some other stuff. And the operation was kind of a success because it lessened his epilepsy. He had far fewer seizures and he could live a normal life on that count, but it caused anterograde amnesia, meaning that after the surgery, he couldn't form any new memories. He didn't have retrograde amnesia, so he could remember everything up to the surgery. He could remember his own past, but he couldn't form new memories. And obviously, that's going to cause some problems in trying to live a good life. And of course, as case studies work, as soon as psychologists figured out that this was a thing that had happened, they wanted to talk to Henry Molaison and figure out what he could and couldn't do, what was impaired by this severe brain damage. And he actually had pretty normal performance on assessments of intellectual ability. So they tested his IQ, and he was doing pretty good. So his short-term memory, his word stores, that sort of stuff seemed to be unaffected. And he even had normal performance on his working memory tests. So he could do okay with short-term and working memory, and he had his previous memories pretty fine. When they tested numbers, he basically did like an average human being. His digit span was fine. He could remember lists just like you or I. But he had the problems with forming new memories. So we can again take some information out of this, and we've figured out that working memory doesn't seem to require those temporal structures. Working memory and short-term memory are different systems. I think that's something we'll talk about in the video. But another part that we care about is that our medial temporal structures are important in the formation of semantic and episodic long-term memories. So formation of our long-term memories, both semantic and episodic, so our declarative or explicit long-term memory, that formation requires those structures. But the retrieval of information that's stored in long-term memory isn't necessary, that it doesn't require these medial temporal structures. So the part of the brain that was damaged, he could still retrieve old memories, he just couldn't make new ones. So while that was playing, I was double checking this right here, and I just wanted to be clear, this short term should actually be long term, to match what we had talked about and what we said in the video, that the short term / working memory is different from long term memory, because with HM, we're seeing that he can have fully functional short-term memory and working memory. His digit span is fine. He can perform mental math, but he had problems with the long-term memory. So I apologize for that error. Just cross that out and write in long-term. All right. So our first two case studies, the two really cool ones with videos, have showed that they can have functional short-term memory, but problems with their long-term memory. So showing that they're different systems and showing us some other stuff in the process. Next, we're going to talk about KF, and this is going to be a different perspective yet again. So KF is someone that we don't actually know what the KF stands for. With HM, we figured it out. I think it has something to do with the fact that HM is deceased, so they were able to release his name. But try as I might, I can't figure out who KF is. So if you ever happen to stumble across the information, let me know. So KF was in a motorcycle accident and it damaged his left parietal occipital region. So this part here on the left side, right in between the parietal and the occipital lobe. And our left parietal is involved in language and mathematics. So that is not a great spot to be suffering damage. And so KF suffered really bad short-term memory damage. And specifically short-term because his digit span was reduced to 2. So when we had talked about having a grocery list where we could remember 7 things plus or minus 2, his was even worse than mine is, and he would struggle if he had 2 things on his list. Sometimes it was even difficult for him to remember a single number. But despite this really, really severe short-term memory damage, he was perfectly fine with his long-term memory. He didn't have anterograde or retrograde amnesia. He could do either. But he couldn't hold anything in his short-term memory, which kind of makes some problems for us. So if we're looking at what KF has taught us, it's that our long-term memory doesn't require a functioning short-term memory in order to encode new information. And if you've been following along throughout this lecture, you might be sitting there thinking, wait, what? Because that's going to go against everything that we've talked about with our 3-component model, which I have conveniently placed at the bottom here. So to get something into long-term memory, our model says that we get this sensory input. It's going to pass through our sensory registers. If we're paying attention, we can encode that information to bring it into our short-term or working memory. We could rehearse it to keep it in our short-term or working memory, or we could encode it into long-term memory. But what we're saying here with KF is that this part doesn't work. And so we're somehow getting information going from our sensory registers, skipping everything in the middle, and going into our long-term memory, which, like I said, goes against our model. And so the working theory now is that the 3-component model is mostly okay because every other case study that we've looked at, every experiment that we've run seems to function within this model, but there are these odd cases that seem to go against it. And so the thought, which our textbook doesn't really talk about too much, but I have looked into, is that there is a secondary pathway where the information that comes in from our sensory registers, it can go to our short-term or working memory, or it can keep going into our long-term memory. It doesn't have to be dealt with or processed or retained in our short-term memory. It can keep going into long-term without that extra step. So, an interesting thing, and one of the reasons why these case studies are so important. And if we wanted to look at how they compare, so Clive Wearing and HM had functional short-term and working memory, but no long-term memory, and KF had no short-term memory, but okay long-term memory. So again, showing us that they're different systems, but also teaching us other stuff along the way. And we are very, very close to the end, but I really want to get through this next couple of slides very quickly because these are things that are going to help us consolidate our short-term and working memory stuff and connect it into our long-term memory stuff. And again, we're going to look at remembering lists. And when we're asking people to remember lists, we see something called the serial position effect. And this effect describes the relationship between a word's position in a list and its probability of recall. So earlier on, when we talked about remembering words in a list, we had the faster that you were able to respond and tell them what words you recalled, the more of those words you could recall. But this is looking at, instead of overall number of words you recalled, now we're going to start caring about what order you received the words in and what order you remember those words. So the first part of this serial position effect is called the primacy effect. And if you think prime meaning sort of the first, the beginning, our primacy effect tells us that it's easy to remember things at the beginning of the list. So the first couple of things that you were given from that list, sorry for the noise. Okay, so for the first couple of things that you were given from that list, you can remember those easily. Then we're going to look at the recency effect. And you might figure this out, that the things that are most recent, that are closest to the end, the present, those are going to be easier to remember. So the recency effect says it's easy to remember the things that you've encountered most recently at the end of the list. And what this looks like is a U-shaped distribution. And again, so we have our probability of recall, just like the previous graphs we've looked at, where higher means you're remembering more of the words in your list. But at the bottom, we're starting to care about the serial position in the list. So was it the first item, the second item, the third, all the way up to 20 things on this list? And so the person could sit there and they could list 20 different things. Maybe they're going to give you 20 fruits and vegetables. And you're really good at remembering the first 3 or 4 or 5. And you're really good at remembering the last 3 or 4. And then the ones in the middle, you're going to do really poorly at. And so this U-shaped distribution is showing us primacy, where you remember the first couple, and recency, where you remember the last couple. And that's pretty good. But now we're going to ask what happens, of course, if we manipulate the situation. What if we do the standard thing that we've talked about with these lists? What if we delay people? What if we don't allow them to answer right away? And that's exactly what we tested here. So the purple line is what happens when you give that person the list, and the same thing, proportion of items correct and position in the list. So the exact same axes as this graph here, just a little bit prettier. And so our purple shows that primacy effect at the beginning, kind of poor performance in the middle, and then a recency effect at the end. That's normal. But if we delay the test, if we make them wait 30 seconds, if we distract them for 30 seconds before we ask them what they remember from the list, look at what happens. We still see our primacy effect, where they remember the first couple of items on the list, but our recency effect disappears. And so the way that they've interpreted this is that primacy is when things have started to be put maybe into our long-term storage, maybe we're holding on to it a little bit better, we're storing it for later, and we've only stored the first couple of items. But our recency effect, because it's disappeared after a delay of more than 20 seconds, recency effect would be stuff that was still in our short-term memory, stuff that we still had in our short-term memory to access, where if we wait for 30 seconds, which is longer than our short-term memory can hold that information, that effect disappears. So our recency effect is going to be due to our short-term memory, and our primacy effect is due more to the long-term memory. At least, that's the theory for now.